Well, this is a good segue into the other story I want to talk about today. I mean, like along the lines of how pointing out hypocrisy really doesn't get you very far, or really kind of like occludes like a kind of rational assessment of what's happening. Is that like you have to bake in a certain irrationality, and I'm talking, of course, about the election results of was it Chapo was roundly defeated. His recall, he was easily recalled. I mean, it's an election that like I think like I don't know 50,000 people voted in, but of those who did vote, he was washed. It was not close, and of course that this is a an occasion for reflection or on the media campaign and to portray San Francisco as some kind of lawless hellhole, but also like the limits of pointing out hypocrisy, because I was like just trying to think about all this, and yeah, like you can say that like yeah, crime was in every respect higher in the 1990s, but it feels worse now. And you can point out like the irrationality of that, but like again, it only takes you so far. And I think this really does get into this sort of having to take seriously, and I'm not saying this to be glib or ironic, but like to take seriously the forces of vibes in like how people perceive reality. Because the thing is, like, anecdotally and statistically, like whether it's New York City or San Francisco, like street crime and quality of life crimes were higher in the 90s. But the 90s were an era that was like the last golden age. The 90s are an era when people like
Yep.
believed in a future. So when they were mugged on the street, it was easier to just sort of like shrug off and just be like, them's the breaks, and like it's not the end of the world. But like now, well into the 21st century, and especially as well, like in the context of COVID lockdowns and people being indoors more than ever, reality really is what people feel it to be. And there's no really, and especially if you're running for office or trying to defend a political program that people are blaming for why they feel so fucked up, you can't just say, well, like you're actually wrong because crime was actually much higher in the 90s and you weren't complaining about it then. Nor can you really notice the fact that like now that Biden's out of office, all of these problems like drug addiction and homelessness will continue to get worse in San Francisco, but no one will complain about it, or they'll be indoors all day on the computer or watching the news thinking about it. So the problem will essentially go away.
I mean, the problem will go away when they get what they really want, which is mass deportation of homeless people out of expensive urban areas. That's the long-term goal. It has nothing to do with really crime as per se. It is that the thing that keeps getting worse, like crime is going up and down. And I do think part of this is relative sense, because yes, crime was much higher in the 90s, but the violent crime boom that began in the late 60s in the United States climaxed in like late 80s, early 90s. So while crime was higher then than it is now, it was also steadily declining throughout the 90s. And we had the historic lows there, or the aughts. Now it's going up, not steadily and not in a smooth way, but like it's jumping up in places. And that's a different feeling than being around a higher total crime that feels like it's going away. So you have that like really getting in people's mind. But the other thing is that the real thing that they're miserable about, and it isn't crime, they're not the victims of crime, usually. It's that they are having to see the real results of the neoliberal era's impact on urban life, and the ability of people who don't make six figures to securely live in a city.
I'm like, man, like I think it's among the groups of people who do make six figures are finding out that that's six figures, like they still feel squeezed as hell, and they're getting priced out of places like San Francisco and Manhattan or Brooklyn, and so that what they do have, they feel way more protective of, or that they feel like they're losing it or losing ground is more like profoundly and deeply felt. And yeah, like if you're like work for Chesa or supported the campaign, you can point that like violent crime actually fell during his tenure as DA of San Francisco. But like for the people, like whether it's a media created reality or not, like it's a reality that exists in people's heads. And like, I don't know what the fucking answer to that is. Cause like when you have like sure, it's a well-funded propaganda campaign to convince everyone across the country that every city is like a lawless hellhole. And like, obviously the cruelty and sadism and all that, and the lying is all there. But like, yeah, like the vibes make it so that everyone just feels fucked up and afraid all the time. And it's hard to really gauge like what a kind of, I don't know, any rational political campaign could do to, counteract that.
You'd have to do things that local officials can't do. like build fucking housing in large amounts and give people it, which you couldn't do even if you could do it, because you are undermining like a fundamental social contract that is crucial in like maintaining literal, like the actual capitalist system. Like you have to have homelessness. You have to have the possibility of losing your citizenship in any meaningful sense, no longer being a person like other people. If you don't have a job, that can't go away. So that means you cannot do the thing that would actually solve these problems, like create a large amount of accessible housing, because then unemployment, for example, is not a death sentence. And if it's not a death sentence, then what you're willing to work for, that calculation changes drastically. I mean, we're already on the verge of the Fed triggering a recession on purpose to discipline the labor market as it stands. They're sure as hell not going to get rid of the disciplinary mechanism of the existence of homeless people. But the problem is we're now reaching this contradiction in these cities, where yes, the maintenance of the system in general requires homelessness. And if you have a situation where real estate is the only real source of value anymore in these cities, then that's going to only jack up costs, and it's going to only keep kicking people out of their homes. It's only going to increase homelessness. So that's not going to change. The system that homelessness supports creates that. But that means there's a bunch of people with a lot of money who actually do vote in every election and actually do influence and determine the course of municipal politics, who are sick of seeing homeless people all the time. That makes them anxious. It makes them uneasy, as you said. It makes the vibe bad, and they want something to be done about it. Now, the reason I think a lot of them supported Putin for 2.5 years ago is because they're like, hey, here's a chance to do something that can make this problem go away with me feeling like I'm a bad person. Because these are liberals, remember.
Yeah, they all support criminal justice reform and ending the war on drugs, but like they don't follow that to the logical conclusion of what that would actually entail. Well, they just want like a nicer solution.
All they can do is vote, because all they could do is vote for someone like a DA who has the discretion to do something like not prosecute certain offenders, but can't build housing, can't provide the sort of federal money that would actually be required to fix the real issues that people are having a problem with. And so this recall of Putin is just showing that they were like, well, we tried to be nice. It didn't work. And since things can only get worse, then there's only option going to be left on the table is going to be the one offered of, we will just make them leave. And then they will be somewhere else. And then they still exist as something to be scared of. My God, where are they going? But they're no longer a thing that, like, fucks up your vibe as an urban liberal.
Yeah. I mean, we're in the past 40 years, I can think of maybe like 3 instances where capital has done cutting off like a little part of its fingernail to satiate the rest of the body. That is giving some concession to people, whether it's easing some expense or some like social spending outlay. Literally, I would say 3 or 4 times since 1980. We're so far beyond not just like any left movement or any even like social democratic center left program. We're so far beyond even just like a paternalistic self-governing capital state where it will, for the long-term gain, give people something. That all politics is now just operating on pure id. And we like saying that that's Republicans, that's the Trump people, that's just MAGA people, that's before that the Tea Party people, but it's everyone. It's everyone. It is just seeing what is directly in front of you and responding to whatever is put in front of you after that, how you can put the two together. Like, of course, they don't like seeing homeless people. How does that connect to Putin? Oh, well, the cops say, they won't arrest people because Putin won't prosecute them. Well, there's nothing really stopping them from kicking all the homeless people out, the cops now. Even if Putin had stayed in. He's very limited to stop them from doing that. I don't think really anyone could stop them at this point. But they're as atavistic and reactive as anyone else.
And Matt, I want to get back to what you said about how, it's back what I said like earlier about how like the difference between like now and the 90s as it regards like sort of managerial like liberal reformism or whatever is that nobody thinks anything is getting better. And everyone sort of knows and feels that everything is only going to get worse. And so like, your bandwidth for like, I don't know, like nicer or better solutions is vanishes with that as well. Because like when you don't believe there's a future, like all you want to do is hold on to what you have at the moment. And like you're not willing to sort of like, yeah, like give up a little bit in the short term for like much better results in the long term, at least theoretically.
Yeah.
And yeah,
There's
like, and
no
I also think like,
institutional trust in any of these things. Like, okay, you can raise my taxes. You can say you're gonna, like, say for example, take money from the police department and give it to some sort of magical social service. But I've lived in this country my entire life, and that's never what happens when you give money to an institution or give
yeah.
authority to an institution. So why would that change now?
Yeah.
And like another thing, like you hear people say is that like every time I leave my house, like it's a nightmare, and I'm afraid. Like when I leave my house, and I think the leave the house thing is telling because like I sort of as I like touched on earlier, I think like the more time you spend inside your house, the more you are afraid of what's outside the door of your house.
Absolutely.
And like I think that is because like and like maybe if we had like a different media or different culture that would be different, but we don't. So like I mean any attempt to deal with these problems has to like bake that into it in terms of like how you deal with it. And I truly don't know what the answer is because eventually the people who vote will just get fed up with it. And like it's just a question of like what's coming down is like being homeless now is like being homeless or mentally ill or addicted to addicted to drugs, that is just illegal. But being homeless and mentally ill is like not a crime in and of itself. But like what's happened is that like, yeah, like you're de facto not a citizen anymore. And the crime of not having enough money to afford rent is now, yeah, like now that's a felony. Like that's a crime. Your rights can be taken away from you.
It's literally going to be a felony in Tennessee. They just passed a law making it a felony to camp outside of a designated area.
It sort of makes me think about the profile of mass shooters. The age has slid in the last 40 years. It used to be like the phrase "going postal." It was synonymous with like postal workers going into their workplace and like shooting their fucking boss and 5 other people. That like workplace shootings made up like the lion's share of mass shootings, and they still make up like a huge percentage. But in the last few decades, that's shifted younger, and like school shootings have become more prevalent. That there is, I mean, that's something you do broadly if you have no optimism, right? A lot of other things go into that, but that's like something you do when you have no optimism. And when you're doing it that young and you're seeing that more and more, I mean, little bit of a trend, but that's everyone. No one sees the future. Everyone just reacts to it differently. Like an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old who everything else is working against them mentally. Maybe they were just always a bad seed. Yeah, that is how they'll react. But someone who maybe doesn't have those immediate antisocial impulses would never think of buying a gun. But they're all things you do when you do not think there's a future, and you just got to shuffle the chips on the table around a little bit before you die.
I mean, I just think that like, yeah, it's just whatever strategy of tension is like coursing its way through the veins of this country is really having its desired effect. And I think we're seeing that now. It's just like the nihilism and just like distrust of everyone and just hatred for just everyone around you. The hatred and fear that's just coursing through the veins of this country right now is, I mean, it's indescribable. It's really frightening. And like, and I think, because like in order to like our friend Jacob Bacharach made this point where it's just like in order to advance the onslaught or just the advance of the cultural right, liberals are just going to choose like the smallest groups possible and just throw them to the wolves, starting with the unhoused or trans people, and like you could throw them that bone to see if that'll like stop their rapid advance on power and our culture. And like the homeless and the mentally ill are they're a very easy target.